Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep Series 9 and Week 67 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last series we spent all 8 weeks looking at a few letters, including 5 weeks just on letter number 210 about the Zimmerman script. Now, this series we're going to stick with the letters again, if for no other reason than the fact that I left letter 211 unfinished. Now, letter 211 was that letter to Rona Bear, in which Tolkien answered an amazing number of questions, shedding light on Elbereth, Glorfindel, how the ring escaped the destruction of Numenor, the color of the wizards, and whether the creature the Witch King rode on was a pterodactyl. And we concluded with a line that shoots down all those Tom Bombadil conspiracy theories: the One does not physically inhabit any part of Ea. But those answers, as many of them as there were, are not all that's in the letter. And the rest of what Tolkien writes is really worth looking at. Now, after having spent some time talking about the One, Manwë, and Melkor, Tolkien adds, "May I say that all this is mythical, and not any kind of new religion or vision. As far as I know, it is merely an imaginative invention to express, in the only way I can, some of my dim apprehensions of the world. All I can say is that if it were history, it would be difficult to fit the lands and events or cultures into such evidence as we possess, archaeological or geological, concerning the nearer or remoter part of what is now called Europe, though the Shire, for instance, is expressly stated to have been in this region." Now, that latter point is made when Tolkien wrote in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring, "The regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the Old World, east of the sea." Now, Tolkien continues in letter 211, "I could have fitted things in with greater verisimilitude if the story had not become too far developed before the question ever occurred to me." Now, we know that he did make efforts to fit his mythology to the history of the primary world, but many of those problems were never resolved. The idea of Arda starting out as flat and only becoming spherical after the destruction of Numenor, the creation of the stars, sun, and moon, and so on. Now, I don't doubt that he could have made them fit with greater verisimilitude, that just means the appearance of being true or real, had he intended to do that from the beginning, but he was telling a story, and as he says here, the story became too far developed for him to change it to fit reality. I suppose reality will just have to change to accommodate Tolkien. He continues, "I doubt if there would have been much gain, and I hope the evidently long but undefined gap in time between the Fall of Barad-dûr and our days is sufficient for literary credibility, even for readers acquainted with what is known or surmised of prehistory." Now, this is where Tolkien gives us his own belief about where we are in terms of the ages of the earth. He includes in a footnote, and you know you've made it, when Tolkien not only replies to you, but his reply is so detailed it needs footnotes. He includes in a footnote that he imagines the Fall of Barad-dûr was about 6,000 years ago, and, quote, that "we are now at the end of the Fifth Age, if the ages were of about the same length as Second Age and Third Age. But they have, I think, quickened, and I imagine we are actually at the end of the Sixth Age, or in the Seventh." And that makes me wonder, what for Tolkien would have been the major historical markers or events that indicated the end or the beginning of those ages? The First Age began with the awakening of the elves at Cuiviénen. The Second Age began after the defeat of Morgoth. The Third Age began after the defeat of Sauron. And the Fourth Age began after the One Ring was destroyed. If Tolkien thinks we're in the Seventh Age, then we've had some events happen that would have ended the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Ages, and I have to wonder what those are. Anyway, we don't find that out, of course. Tolkien continues, acknowledging that he's constructed an imaginary time, but kept my feet on my own Mother Earth for place. I prefer that, he says, to the contemporary mode of seeking remote globes in space. However curious, they are alien and not lovable with the love of blood kin. That is a very interesting way of approaching, let's say, science fiction, right? The place isn't beloved by us because it is not our place. Makes me think kind of what he thought about some of C.S. Lewis's stuff, maybe the space trilogy I'm thinking about. Now, speaking of place, Tolkien also points out something we've talked about before. In fact, just the last Word Nerd Wednesday when we talked about Middle-earth. He writes, "Middle-earth is, by the way, and if such a note is necessary, not my own invention. It is a modernization or alteration of an old word for the inhabited world of men, the ecumeny, middle because thought of vaguely as set amidst the encircling seas and in the northern imagination, between ice of the north and the fire of the south. Old English midden-yard, medieval English midden-aird, middle-aired. Many reviewers seem to assume that Middle-earth is another planet. Well, I imagine there are some that do. Finally, Tolkien addresses some interesting theological issues, starting by saying this. Theologically, if the term is not too grandiose, I imagine the picture to be less dissonant from what some, including myself, believe to be the truth. In other words, he doesn't see his mythology, his story, as being inconsistent with the beliefs of his own faith, Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism. But, he continues, since I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas, but is not an allegory of them or anything else, and does not mention them overtly, still less preach them, I will not now depart from that mode and venture on theological disquisition for which I am not fitted. I really, really like this. I mean, yeah, he admits there are some religious ideas in his stories, but once again, he points out his story is not an allegory of them, nor is it an allegory of anything, for that matter. Furthermore, the story doesn't mention these religious ideas overtly, and it certainly does not preach them. Man, going back to what I talked about earlier about seeking remote globes in space, now I really can't help thinking that he's got a bit of C.S. Lewis on the mind here. Now, right after this, Tolkien goes on to say what The Lord of the Rings is about, and this would be good for us to keep in mind. He writes, if the tale is about anything other than itself, it is not, as seems widely supposed, about power. Power-seeking is only the motive power that sets events going and is relatively unimportant, I think. It is mainly concerned with death and immortality and the escapes, serial longevity and hoarding memory. Death, immortality, and I love the escapes, meaning both the elves' serial longevity, that is the fact that their lives will last as long as Arda itself, and also the elves' tendency to hoard memory. So the next time somebody asks you, what is The Lord of the Rings about? It's about death, immortality, and the escapes. Now, for now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. But be sure to join me again next week when we'll begin a lengthy look at letter number 212, which is really the same letter as 211. That is, it's an unsent draft of a continuation of that letter to Rona Bear. Now, in the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. And join me again tomorrow for today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.